this story understandably focus on China, where you have the most dramatic changes. But India is very, very much part of that story as well. And I think, when I was asked to speak to this conference, people wanted me to talk a little bit about how the rest of the world sees India. And the truth is that the rest of the world does not actually pay nearly as much attention to India as it should. If you were to look at the Indian story, suppose that China were not in the picture, getting so much of the focus and, of course, also so much of the hostility. Suppose we only looked at India, then we would be saying, what an incredible story, something that was really unprecedented in global economic history. What we've seen since India really made a turnaround about 30 years ago, we've seen a quadrupling of GDP per capita. That's transformational. That's huge. We've seen now India go. Now it has now converged significantly on advanced countries. It's still poor, but not in the same level at all. If we were to say, best measure says that Indian GDP per capita is about 12% of the U.S. level right now, which sounds low because it is, but that's way up from 4%, which is where it was not that long ago. And if you want some comparators, as best, the economic numbers like this are always abstractions that don't at all really capture the richness of life. But for what it's worth, India right now appears to have about the same per capita income as Japan did in 1960, or about the same per capita income that South Korea had in 1980. And of course, we know what happened to those countries. They made the full transition to advanced nations in the period since then. So India has making a great leap. Another way to say this is that India achieved as much economic progress in 30 years as Great Britain did in 150 years. It's a very, very rapid pace of transformation. Now, one question that people ask, when you look at that Indian number and you look at those comparisons, you say, why does there still seem to be so much visible poverty in India if it's made? There appears to be more visible poverty, certainly, than there was in Japan in 1960. And the answer is one problem that you will have to deal with, which is a high degree of income inequality. India has a Gini coefficient, for those of you who do this sort of thing, of around 0.47. That's high. That's similar to someplace like Brazil, which is famous for high income inequality. Much of that is rural-urban, but there's also a high inequality within the urban areas. And so India has made enormous strides, but they're not very evenly distributed. And that is an issue that I know that people here are well aware of and will have to be dealt with future policy. But the progress is extraordinary. And of course, this is a very big country, which people have not at some level fully noticed. I was actually a little surprised, even doing the research for this talk myself, that more people haven't noticed that India is now, adjusting for purchasing power, is now the world's third largest economy. It has overtaken Japan. It is only the United States and China, or China and the United States, depends a little bit on your measurement, are bigger economies than India. It's far bigger than any European country. So this is an economic superpower by any normal standard in the world. It doesn't get full credit for it for, I think, a couple of reasons. One is that at market exchange rates, it's still substantially smaller than that, and that's a familiar issue. The market value, market price GDP lags in poorer countries, so that from the point of view of somebody out to make money by selling, India is not quite as big as it really should be. But That will change over time. And the other is that the nature of India's export boom is one that has, I think, just been less visible, less, in some ways, good for you, less conspicuous in its disruption than the export boom from some other emerging markets. But this is an extraordinary achievement. Question you want to ask is, what's responsible for that extraordinary progress in India? And that's the first question you want to ask. The second question you want to ask is, can it continue? What are the reasons for optimism and pessimism? But which I think is probably the more important question. But let's just talk a bit about what changed. So clearly, there was a dramatic change in India's policy. The old self-sufficiency, inward-looking policy was changed. India now exports a large share of its GDP. It has moved to becoming a reasonably open economy, actually quite open considering the population. So the tariffs reduced dramatically. They were extremely high, now much reduced. Other forms of trade restriction eliminated. Also, a great deal of liberalization, probably even more important, liberalization within the domestic economy. As you presumably all know from the point of view of U.S. politics, I'm on the center left, but that doesn't mean that I think that government should have a really heavy hand on the economy. India used to be, within my lifetime, even within my professional lifetime, used to be famous for the license Raj, where basically everything that was not specifically permitted was forbidden, and in which the bureaucratic obstacles to any kind of business were immense. That has not gone away completely, but is enormously reduced. And there have been a set of pro-business policies in general. India's overall thrust is still, perhaps, I'm sure that there are plenty of people in this room who will tell you things that they're upset about in terms of obstacles to doing business. But India has clearly become a much easier, much better place to do business than it was. I noticed last night the Prime Minister saying that India, in terms of ease of doing business, has moved up from number 148 to number 100. Being number 100 on that is not actually, that's not exactly a badge of distinction, but it's a lot better than it was, and it's a major improvement. India has also, by the way, moved up. One of the things that we still do talk about that was a big problem was infrastructure, and it still is, but it's better. Definite improvement on that criterion as well. So across the board, India has followed policies that have opened up the possibilities for doing business, have made it a very attractive place for international companies to do business. It's there, and it has been a real transformation of policy, and it came at a good time. There was a wave, if you like. There was a great a wave of globalization upon which countries with the right policies could surf. And India liberalized, India opened at the right time. So India's policy, and of course those goes both ways. India was witnessing changes in policies elsewhere. Indian policymakers were aware to at least some degree of the new opportunities, and so India was able to change its policies at just about the time that the world was becoming a much more friendly place for development, and took advantage. So what we have here is one of the great success stories of development so far, although still only up to a certain point. All of that said, India is different. And in some ways, India has done some things that are quite unique. Last I was able to check the numbers, India is now a major exporting country. its exports of services are roughly comparable to its exports of manufactured goods. That's unprecedented. Nobody, certainly no large economy, has ever done that before. This is a new phenomenon in world economic history. It used to be that we just said services are not tradable. Services have to be provided locally. You cannot, aside from transport, nothing really can be exported as a service. That is no longer apparently the case, and above all, in terms of countries that have managed to do a lot of service exports, India takes the lead. And it's actually interesting. The other major exporters of services are basically in the business of providing financial services. So Britain is an exporter of services, but what we're really talking about is banking in the City of London. India, of course, is exporting a much wider range, everything from outsourced IT. I mean, call centers is actually almost receding into the past, but was one of the first places where people became aware of it. But this is something new. It means that India has followed a very, although it's part of this great globalization wave, it has followed a different path from those of other developing countries. Instead of a manufacturing-centered entry into the world market, India has in large part had a service-centered excursion into the world market, which is something new, something different, and I think possibly, and as I'll explain in a couple of minutes, something that might work very much in India's favor as we look at the at the days ahead. All right. Back to the world economy for a moment here. There's a common myth that says that globalization always increases, that the integration of the world economy is a straight upward line, that trade always grows faster than income, that the world always becomes smaller. History tells you different. History says that globalization has come in waves that sometimes recede, so that we had an enormous increase in world trade between 1870 and 1913, but then it fell back relative to world income to about half what it had been. And that was partly because of wars,